Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream on the History of podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Jack Bull and Dr. Stephen Boyce. And today we're going to be discussing Bishop Ignatius of Antioch, which letters of his, or I should say, which version of the letters of his did he actually write? So that's what we're going to be discussing today. Before we continue, I want to say that Jack Bull's YouTube channel, Patristica, tagged in the description below, and Stephen Boyce's YouTube channel, Facts, tagged in the description below. So if you're not subscribed to either of them already, you can go ahead and do so and click on those tags. So with that being said, thank you both for joining me today, Jack and Stephen.
Pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Before we continue, let's do a brief recap on who exactly is Ignatius of Antioch. Let's get like a brief description of him for people that may be watching this video that have never heard of this guy.
Stephen, do you want to go for it?
Sure, yeah. So Ignatius of Antioch is a bishop in Antioch, one of the earliest bishops at the beginning of the times of the church. He is alleged to be a companion and a disciple of the Apostle John. And that he was leading the church under succession from Peter and Paul. There's actually some discrepancy on who ordained him. But he was apparently from the group of the apostles. He was left and entrusted with the church of Antioch. The story is that he was taken from Antioch and he was carried all the way down to Rome, or up to Rome and over. And by the time he received there, he was given a death sentence by the wild beast animals. He was killed. And so on his way there, the story goes that he wrote 7 letters, 6 of them to churches, 1 to another bishop, Polycarp, another disciple of John. And he wrote these letters on the way. And as he received the churches received these letters, there became a lot of discussion about them. There's a lot of theology packed into them. There's a lot of ecclesiology packed into them. And so there's a lot of discussion about his martyrdom. So kind of in the summary, that's who he is. He's a bishop of Antioch who is martyred. He is honored and venerated. He's a canonized saint and martyred. He's used in a lot of the Eucharistic prayers. He's one of the names often mentioned. He's also in the Litany of the Saints, if you ever listen to the Litany of the Saints. So he is venerated. He is honored in the churches because of his heroic willingness to die for Christ and his willingness to die as a martyr.
So now there's several different versions of the letters. Now that we got the description of Ignatius out of the way, there's the long recension, short recension, middle recension. Why do we have these different versions of Ignatius's letters? What's happened there?
So this is where I think the conversation gets a lot more interesting. I mean, it's already quite cool that we have a bishop in the 2nd century with such a great martyrology, but the letters and the complex question surrounding the Corpus Ignatianum is one that I think is fascinating to scholars for several reasons, which I'm sure we'll go into later. So as Jacob rightly mentioned, we broadly have 3 recensions and 3 letter collections as laid out by Joseph Barber Lightfoot in 1885. And although that is in some sense true, it doesn't necessarily present all of the extant manuscripts or justify exactly what we have. So if you want to go and learn more about that, there are plenty of videos on Jacob's channel, on my channel, on Facts. They're all over the place. Basically, wherever I am, I'm talking about this. But just as a brief reminder that we have these major letter collections, and I'm happy for the sake of this discussion to go with 3. There's a 3 letter collection, a 7 letter collection, and then a 13 letter collection. And all of these letter collections are attributed to Ignatius, except for one letter in the 13 letter collection, which is a response from Ignatius, from Mary of Casabolita to Ignatius, who he writes to formally. Now, on top of those letter collections, we then have recensions. And this is the amount of material that is comprised within each epistle. So, for example, we have the letter to Polycarp in every single letter collection. But in each letter collection, it has more or less material. So in the short recension, it has the least, the middle, no surprise, the middle amount, and the long speaks for itself. And there are, like I say, broadly 3 recensions as well. The weird anomaly to this is Romans, which appears to come to us actually in 5 recensions, but that is a whole nother story on its own. And so these are, broadly speaking, the recensions and collections of Ignatius. Now, the background and the hypotheses that surround how these different recensions came into being are, I'm sure, what we're going to unpack, as Stephen and I slightly disagree about the origins of these texts. But it's important to say that scholarship is largely agreed at least on one point, and that's why it won't be the focus of today's session so much, and that is that the long recension presents the latest form of the text. It's the most interpolated, the most corrupted, with things like biblical references, complex later theologies, perhaps in relation to Arianism, and other such things. So the primary discussion between scholars today is which recension and letter collection is the oldest. Is it the short 3-letter collection comprising Polycarp, Ephesians, and Romans? Or is it the middle recension of 7 letters, which then has a further 4 being Magnesians, Smyrnaeans, Trallians, and Philadelphians?
And when was this long recension of Ignatius created?
Well, there's a long and an extended long. So there's 13 and then there's 17 all of a sudden. So now there's actually up to 17 letters, and which of course involved the Blessed Virgin and a letter to him and he responding back, and the Apostle John is now involved too. So there's different longer recensions too, in addition to that. And by the way, just kind of to be careful on this, long recension isn't just speaking to the corpus as a whole. It's particularly the content within it, because even in some of the middle recensions, some of these 13 letters could be considered a part of more of a middle recension in different places. This is how complex this really is. It's not that clean. But recension is specifically talking about the content, not the number of books, although a lot of times they just happen to be hand in hand. But there's 13, and now then there's 17 in addition to that. But when we're talking about the long recension, these are much later, after the, really the medieval period. Embellishment has taken over. Ignatius is a heroic martyr. And since he was connected to the Apostle John, well, naturally, let's have a letter with him talking to John in it so we can actually envision what that relationship looked like. And of course, the Blessed Virgin was, living with John and stayed with John. So if he's talking to John, he's talking to Mary. If he's talking to Mary, he's talking to John. So now there's correspondence between Mary and him. So this expansion is really more of the embellishment that happens many, many, many years later. It is definitely post 5th century, and I think farther than that. But because by the time we have Eusebius, for example, Eusebius Caesarea only speaks of 7. Jerome speaks of 7. So there's no way at that point, by the time we have the more Latinized influence in the West with Jerome, or Greek transcripts coming from Origen to Eusebius, that there's more than 7 at this point. So it could have gone from 3, which is Jack's view, and evolved into 7, but it was no more than 7, at least by the time of Jerome. So I would say this is much, much later inventions and developed over a long period of time, not like a single year. I don't think one single writer did this. I think it was an expansion over a long period of time.
So when you both look at these texts, how does the debate work in terms of like which text probably came first? I'm talking about like methodology. What kind of determining factors play a role in these conclusions?
Yeah, where you place your emphasis in terms of methodology is super, super important, because the tools that you use to approach the task are going to greatly affect your outcomes. And so I think that maybe even before I just touch on those tools, it's important to state maybe some of the things that we agree upon before we even enter into some of the more nuanced questions, because I think it would just be helpful to set that grounding. So first and foremost, Stephen and I both believe that an Ignatius existed, that he was a martyr, and that he was killed somewhere in Rome, but under the arrest for being a Christian. So that's really important because there's been some talk, most famously by Dr. White, that Ignatius didn't exist, and there's been some suggestion that he was a fictitious figure. But so that's what we agree upon. Stephen and I also agree that we have something extant of the original Ignatius. So we might disagree about how much, but we do agree that he leaves us something, and that there is a tradition about him that continues into the time of Polycarp, Irenaeus, Origen, and so on. That may seem quite obvious to some, but I just want to get it out there because some don't like it. So methodology wise then, so when I came to tackling the question, I did what basically any scholar had done, which was look at internal evidence and external evidence, because they're broadly the only two categories with which you can consider any of the data. So internal evidence, we might look at things like vocabulary, grammar, style, theology, possible external influences, extant manuscripts. Sorry, that's external evidence. And then on the external evidence side, we might look at attestations and extant manuscripts. And when we combine these things together, then we have a more broader picture, let's say, of what Ignatius is all about. So the first step to my inquiry was actually to use the same methodology that Milton Perry Brown used in 1963, when he compared the middle recension to the long recension in the hopes of proving that the middle recension presented an older version of the text. And the way that he did that was by looking at particular terms, both big theological terms such as episkopos, diakonos, things like that, but also smaller words, prepositions, conjunctions, words like with, for, and. And the way that he went about it was saying, well, look, in this passage here that is only present in the long recension, it has the word gar, meaning for, all over the place. Whereas when we look at passages that are only extant in the middle recension, they tend not to use that word as much. And this is indicative of an entirely different style between the two authors. And I think that most scholars who were proponents of the middle recension of the 7 letters were fairly convinced by his methodology and his conclusions that the middle recension presented an older text. And so therefore I thought, well, it only makes sense then to apply that same set of measurements to the short recension and the middle. And what I found was that, to my mind, the short recension often presents a very different style to the middle, both in its theology, but also in terms of its lexicon and grammar. And this was my first indication that perhaps there was an attempt made to interpolate this short recension rather than the opposite way around, someone redacting the middle into the short. Following that, I then began to look at possible external influences, and in particular the work of Alan Brent in his 2006 book, Ignatius of Antioch and the Second Sophistic, where he actually moves the date of Ignatius's death quite a bit later because of the middle recension's supposed knowledge of this second sophistic material. Things like the imperial cult, the revival of Hellenistic cultic religions and religious practices that he thinks Ignatius is very familiar with. And these things only begin to flourish in the reigns of Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. And in the short recension, these things weren't present. So again, it suggested to me that the short recension could be earlier and the middle recension later. I then proceeded to look at biblical influences and quotations from the New Testament and indeed the Old. And what I found was that the short recension presented far less in the way of canonical material than the middle. And then lastly, I moved to external evidence, to the manuscript traditions, and also to the witnesses or attestations of the texts. And Steve and I disagree slightly about this when people talk about it, but to my mind, all of the earliest quotes we have of Ignatius' epistles are from the short recension. And it's not really until much later that we start to find middle recension attestations becoming more popular. So I put all of these things in the melding pot and came to the conclusion, for now anyway, that the short recension probably presents an older version of the text.
Yeah, just kind of to add on that, I guess my approach to handling the subject was starting with kind of the methodology that Augustine of Hippo gives for a criteria of investigating historical documents. And what you always want to try to find, is there any contemporary support? Well, there happens just to be one for Ignatius, and that's the letter of Polycarp to the Philippians. So that he mentions not only Ignatius, the person, but even mentions some of his writings. So kind of start with a framework there. And then you're looking for data that is corroborated over time. And that's where now you have to evaluate Irenaeus. Now you have to evaluate Origen, Eusebius, Jerome. Now we're able to kind of look at collectively where these letters traveled. And that's where the manuscript data comes in too. We have Greek, we have Latin, we have Coptic, we have Arabic, we have Armenian. So now you're looking at all the external data. And then my approach after that is, after seeing kind of what the external evidence, same approach that really Jack was just talking about a minute ago, is take that external evidence and say, does the claims about this, like Eusebius's claims, is the claims about him accurate? The travels, the direction, can we find reason to corroborate his statement with others or with archaeological discovery? So in my article that I wrote on this, I talked about, could he have been executed during the time of Trajan? And because one of the things that was brought up, and even good scholars are starting to wonder if maybe Ignatius died during the time of the Hadrian, which Jack was just talking about a second ago. Paul Foster is one of those people, and Paul Foster is a pretty conservative theologian on things. And so his perspective is that this happened later. But is there reason to believe Malalas and Eusebius, who say that this man was carried from Antioch to Rome and then killed there? Do we have reason to believe that there was a pathway for this to happen? Well, we have evidence that there were prisoners being transported by Trajan to the circus, to the Colosseum, to be executed because he was using foreign criminals to do that. Do we have reason to believe that he would have been taken on the road to Rome, these different roads? I wrote a whole section in my paper on that as well, talking about the uniqueness of that, because Trajan was he was a master builder at repairing roads and ways for people to get to Rome through different directions, possibly same direction that our character Ignatius would have been taken on. So we see Trajan is involved in a lot of things that would give us reason. It doesn't affirm it, but it gives us reason to believe this isn't far-fetched. People aren't just making this up out of thin air. There is cause for a person who has maybe defied the government or did something to upset the empire. Malalas kind of gives us more of the motive of why Trajan sent him to Rome. In fact, we kind of get an indication from Malalas that Ignatius and Trajan were in the same city in Antioch at the same time. Trajan was there in his travels, and apparently Ignatius insulted him at one of his pagan festivities. And so maybe there was a personal vendetta. I mean, we don't really know. This is what Malalas is telling us that can't be corroborated, but his independent statement gives us something to think about. And then you have to deal with the travel and being taken. And he's saying that he's being transported by certain kinds of military personnel that he calls evil beasts. He's like, I'm being traveled by evil beasts now before I go to the beasts. And so he has this perspective in these writings. And then we look at his travel, his stops, his location, his ports. Where would he have written? What deacons were sent to him? We see letters where deacons are sent to him and they're sent back with correspondence. Could that have possibly happened under the circumstances he was in? So once you kind of like theorize, is this possible for this to take place? Well, then you go into the text themselves and say, do the text show consistency to the external claim? From my perspective, I think that the 7 original letters can align archaeologically, historically, corroborated with other testimony, and internally show harmonization that this happened. Am I dogmatic to the point where I look at somebody like Jack and say, he's off his rocker, he needs help? I mean, he may need help, but that's not probably why. But, when I look at these discussions, I'm always walking into this one with caution, because I could be very wrong. I've read Jack's analysis of the text and the syntax and the wording and the comparisons. And it is compelling enough for all of us to pause and say, we need to be careful how sure we are about this and make sure that we've looked at this as deep as we possibly can and allow ourselves to be updated as new discovery and new dialogue, like Jack and I doing, or new writings come out that show the analysis that we all want, especially once we get a better critical edition of this, because we don't have a good critical edition of Ignatius anyway. Once we're able to do that, we can allow ourselves to be updated. And I know Jack feels the same way. He's willing to change with the evidence, and I am as well. But at this point, we've kind of leaned differently, taking similar approaches, but attacking those approaches slightly different. And you can see that in my writing that I did on this that just released a few weeks ago.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. I mean, it was when I was at the International Patristics Conference last August, it was really my hope not to convince anybody of the short recension per se, but rather to say, why is it that we have someone like Ignatius when, in the history of all of scholarship, all we do is argue about stuff. But with Ignatius, since 1889, and Lightfoot put it down and said this is the case, nobody really reopened the question properly. A couple of scholars tried to argue that they were all spurious. One scholar tried to argue that only 4 were genuine. And so there have been this sort of odd nitpicking about it every now and again. But compared to the controversy on the Didache or on a New Testament text, Ignatius just receives no attention, and clearly that's a problem, not least because we don't have a critical edition, but also because I think my work, Marcus Vincent's work, and originally William Cureton's work has shown at least a sufficient enough issue with the middle recension that we need to reopen it. I'd also point out that, in some ways, Lightfoot recognizes this as well, is that when he creates his edition and has a critical apparatus, he also recommends some readings from the long recension and the short recension instead of the middle as the oldest. And De Camp and Funk in 1909 also recognized sometimes that the long recension presents sometimes an older reading. And it's been really interesting as well recently. I've been contemplating particularly the epistolary corpus of Paul, and we were talking about it a lot on our channel. We had Nina Liversley on yesterday, and I don't quite go as far as her naturally on what I think about Paul. But one of the things we spoke about is that whenever we're dealing with a collection of letters, we are dealing with something that is not original, because no set of texts in that form, of that nature, is sent out as one block. And it's why then when we come to Ignatius and the recensions, that even before we come to unpicking these things, we must be aware that we're dealing with someone who has processed these things. Now, again, there's a difference in food between an organic product, a processed food, and an ultra-processed food. And we might say that also with the epistles of Ignatius. But it's fascinating to me that, that's something that we also need to consider. And we only actually have 2 letters that exist on their own. And I think that in some ways, one of the keys to unlocking Ignatius might lie within them, because they enjoy their own transmission history. That's Polycarp and Romans both exist without any other letters attached to them. And I wondered to what extent, and this is literally some thoughts that I've only been thinking about really properly over the last week, is that perhaps they might be like I said, the key into this question, because of that lack of maybe corruption around them, that adjoining to other letters that could have gone on. Again, this is hypothetical only in the sense that it needs to be researched, but again, I think it does present an important issue. If I may, I think it's important as well to give some hard and fast examples of what Stephen referred to in terms of the lexicographical data that I got together in an attempt to show how the short and the middle are different. I won't list loads of terms and loads of different things, because I appreciate for the viewer that's tedious and they've got no context to surround it in. But just to give you an example of the sort of research that goes into this, one of the words that I found particularly interesting, or types of words that I found particularly interesting in my studies, were compound words. These are words in Greek where we get a particular verb or noun, and it's preceded by a preposition. So, for example, the preposition sun often means together. Sug, sum, sun. It means we do these things together. And it's really odd that in the middle recension, we get loads of these type of compound words. They seem to be a real favorite of the middle recension. And yet in all of those places where it's just the short recension, these compound words largely go absent. And it's my argument, therefore, that if it was the case that someone had redacted the middle recension and put it into the short, then the surgical removal of words such as these and others seems almost impossible, because there's no theological reason to do it. There's no dogmatic or stylistic purpose to it particularly. Rather, it's just this subconscious writing style of a person. And so that's sort of the methodology of the words and terms that Stephen referenced earlier, just put a little bit into context so you can see, what precisely I mean by that.
Yeah, and just kind of feeding into what Jack's talking about, because we see this idea of interpolation, redaction, like which way is the manuscript tradition going. And I want to back up about 2 steps here, because this is something I've thought about even since last week. Jack and I were on another channel together, and we were having a similar discussion. What cause would some of these letters out of the 7, let's just say there were 7 for the sake of argument, which of the 7 would be more likely to be circulated and copied and used the most? Well, Romans would be very obvious. And I think that Romans obviously is the most circulated. Even it's found even in its own form in the martyrdom stories of Ignatius. I mean, we have it isolated by itself in places. And this is what Jack was talking about. There's kind of like 5 recensions as you look at Romans and how. So it seems to be an extremely circulated text. And it would make sense given that it was the last destination he went, regardless of where you believe he started his path. It's his last destination. It is Rome, and Rome had quite a bit of the Roman road distribution and the ability to get word out. We even kind of see this interest by Polycarp, where he wanted more information about what happened to Ignatius in his writing to the Philippians. But it seems like the information traveled better from Rome. Another one, he writes the letter to Polycarp, which is a very important text to a lot of ecclesiology of how did the churches look at each other, their leaders, their deacons, what kind of system did they have in place in the 2nd century? And so would Polycarp had been a bishop like that, who's a successor of John, and another bishop in the line of Peter and Paul, writing to each other or writing one to the other and the other responding and reacting to it, would that one have been very circulated? Yes, you have 2 notorious bishops who are not illiterate, who had the ability to write and had the ability to correspond with the churches. And Ignatius must have been very, very respected. It was almost, and I demonstrate this in my paper, where there seems to be Polycarp was a little bit younger than Ignatius and almost looked up to him as a mentor in a sense, especially after his mentor had already died. John probably died around the year 102, 101, if we take Jerome's date. So by the time this is happening, anywhere between 107 and 113, 114, John's been dead for about 5-6 years. It could be, or more, it could be that he was looking at Polycarp as a mentor, or Polycarp was looking at him as a mentor, and they had this correspondence. So that would have been a preserved and a more circulated text just on the importance of the 2 identities in it, leaders of major sections of the church. The third one is Ephesus. Now, he sent a letter to Ephesus, and that one would be significant to me. One, because it's a major trade route, a lot of ships coming in and out, a lot of ports. And this is the church that is established pretty clearly where John the Apostle was himself. And he is a companion of John. There would have been more knowledge of him. He would have been closer to these churches. But then you look at some of these other churches that maybe not be in the original 7. And why are they not like seen as frequently or regular? Well, the Smyrnans would make sense to me. And I actually think the Smyrnans does show up in places, and Jack and I differ on this one a little bit. But we also have one of the earliest manuscripts of the corpus covering a large section of the Smyrnans. Magnesians is not that significant in the sense of its dominance. Even in the early church, we don't have any writings to the Magnesians in any of the New Testament corpus when you look at those things. And so when you go through these letters, there could be a reason why some did circulate more than others and were transmitted and translated quicker, faster, and further than others, just on the database of these different churches, their different bishops, their significance, their abilities to write, trade routes, going into ports and out of ports. There could be a reason these are the most circulated 3. So I would make that argument as well. But there's also this developmental side of things. I mentioned this in the paper as well in Ephesians 7. in the second section there of 7, the phrase is missing completely in the short recension. But if you go to the middle recension, it speaks of there's only one physician. He's both flesh and spirit. Clearly a knock against some form of Gnosticism, whether Docetism or a different rendition of the Gnostic faith that was going around. Then he goes into it's born, unborn, God and man, true life, etc. Then you go to the long recension, and it's double. Now we're dealing with the virgin birth in its full depths. It's quoting scripture. It's built all this extra packaged fighting words behind it, and it gets more teeth by the long recension. Missing in the short, pretty basic, quick statement about a theological assertion in the middle, and completely blown up and repackaged in the long. And so one of the arguments I made and observed is that the short recension lack this altogether. And we find this as a pattern when there are theological arguments made by Ignatius. They seem to lack in the short recension. So there's two ways we can handle this. Jack takes it from this perspective. I take it from this perspective, and we're still friends. But my perspective is that whoever this Syriac monk or scribe was that was working on the manuscript that we have that survived, which is pretty early of all the manuscripts, that he was not preoccupied with the already established belief system in the Syriac church. His goal was to summarize the story about the man. So even some of the hierarchy ideas of bishopric, or even looking at the sacramental elements of particularly the Eucharist and the body and blood and the bread and the wine, there's only really one statement in Romans that really deals with it. And it wasn't even about the church's belief or even a knock against Docetism perspectives of Gnostic beliefs. He doesn't do that. No, he pulls back and he's just talking about his own personal desires and wants, fighting in his passion against, I'm going to go die. What am I willing to give up? What can I live with? What can I live without? It was more about the man's desire, not so much a theological argument as we see in other places. And one of the arguments that I make is he could be following some of the summaries that we see in a lot of Syriac writing, which is very limited, like Tatian's Diatessaron, which takes all 4 gospels and kind of harmonizes and just focuses on certain elements and leaves others out. Could this be a pattern after, say, Tatian's work, where this scribe in Syria is doing this writing and he's not interested in the theological everybody already believes in, including important doctrines that Jack points out, like the resurrection, like the bishopric, like the diaconate, looking at the Eucharist. These things lack in the short recension, but what's always common is the man, his desires, his travels, his problems, his testimony, what's happening, how he's feeling. This is what it seems like that scribe may be doing. And Jack and I differ here. So I take that angle. Jack takes another angle. And I think that all of these angles need to be considered and on the table. And everybody just kind of has to work through it and say, what makes the most sense? And you might land somewhere close to one of us or way off and different. But I think these are good discussions and they're good dialogues and they're healthy to have. And I love the fact that Jack and I keep getting to have these opportunities to share them, because we're putting everything on the table and saying, look, this is what's happening. We have to do something with it.
Yeah, I do hear your argument. I think that the biggest kicker, though, I find it so difficult to think of a late 2nd century Christian removing all references to the resurrection. I find that just so difficult. Removing New Testament passages, removing the name of Jesus, removing, again, I could sort of accept in some ways certain passages removed about the Eucharist, maybe, and maybe even also of the New Testament. But to remove the resurrection, now, this when compared to Ignatius and his supposed contemporaries is also really important, because if you look at his contemporaries, supposedly of things like 1 Clement or the Didache, it's really interesting that Marcus Vincent pointed out in his 2012 book, whatever it might have been, that called The Resurrection in Early Christianity, that actually the only figure who's supposedly a contemporary of Ignatius who is obsessed with the resurrection in the same way is the middle recension of Ignatius, right? He's not matched the same way by anybody else in terms of his love for resurrection until Marcion of Sinope publishes his New Testament. And then we get what's called resurrection mania, and everybody starts to talk about it. And I think when Marcus wrote that book, he was just stumped by how forward-thinking Ignatius was, as is indeed Alan Brent, but on a different level with regard to the threefold ecclesial hierarchy, again, which Ignatius in the Middle Ascension finds himself as quite the enigma. And so I hate to use the term Occam's razor, partly because it's not Occam's and partly because it's not a razor. But when we then say, which seems more likely, that Ignatius is a great enigmatic figure who stands completely as a prophet in some ways, as a trailblazer on the resurrection and the threefold ecclesial hierarchy, or is it that he's just like his contemporaries? Someone looked back and wrote back into it saying, "Oh, that's a problem. This great figure doesn't mention resurrection, doesn't mention any of these other key dogmas. Let's write them into it." The way I characterize the Short Recension's text is, that Ignatius is not a theologian. His theology is narrow and it is shallow. And to some extent, one can't blame him for that. I mean, okay, even if we believe the story that he was trained by John and appointed by Peter as the second or possibly the third bishop of Antioch, whatever it may have been, one could still see why he'd be narrow and shallow. He's not going to have great concepts of homoousios just yet, or Aristotelian metaphysics. So I also don't think his purpose is to write those things. One of the things that I like about the Short Recension is it's quite vulnerable. It's vulnerable in the sense that he, apart from viewing himself as an authority to help Polycarp, and an authority in the sense that he's a bishop, he also doesn't have this great sense of theology, like theologian style. I don't know how to put it quite, but he doesn't give off arrogant vibes in terms of being the great scholar of all time. Whereas in the Middle Recension, that starts to come, and in the Long Recension, I think he's lost his marbles slightly, and he's got ideas well above his station. Just before we do anything else, I just really want to talk about something that's happening in the comments, because this is sort of drives me nuts at the moment. And again, it's not against anybody in particular. Nathan, I can see you commenting. Again, I have nothing against you at all. I'm sure you're a great guy. But this attempt to just make everybody a myth, I just find very difficult. I listened to Robin Faith Walsh talk about this once, Jacob, I think on your channel. And she said something brilliant. You asked her, do you believe in the historical Jesus? And bear in mind, she's not a Christian, as far as I'm aware. She doesn't practice any faith. Am I right about that, Jacob?
Yeah, I believe that's right.
Yeah. And she just said something really, really funny. She said, look, if he didn't exist, then I have to think that Paul made him up. And if I don't think that Paul made him up, then I have to think someone else made him up. And then I have to think someone else made them up. And I often comment rather flippantly on my channel that Ignatius was made up by Richard III, and Richard III was made up by David Attenborough. And this is sort of a problematic methodology that has been popularized by hyperskeptics like those who, I don't want to name any names, but those who sort of want to perpetuate this idea that, well, if we can't see it, touch it, smell it, taste it, not that we want to taste Ignatius of Antioch in any way, then it doesn't exist. And the answer to that question is that with Ignatius, actually, we have some really good evidence that he existed, even without his letters. Let's just say he wrote nothing. Let's just give that over to one side. He wrote nothing. Well, clearly Polycarp knows who he is, right? That's good. That's a good start. Then we have Irenaeus, who knows who he is. But more important than both of those, we get Lucian of Samosata, who writes this satirical piece called The Death of Peregrinus, obviously based on Ignatius, and is the equivalent of, for those in the UK, Ian Hislop, for those in America, I don't know about your culture, Jimmy Fallon, something like this. I don't know how you guys work. Something like that. And he's making a caricature of Ignatius, mocking him, saying that, he's a cynic, and that he eventually leaves the church. He disgraces himself and sort of makes him out to be this comically useless but also slightly devious figure who also writes epistles, so says Lucian, and even uses some of those compound words that I mentioned earlier in a mocking way.
Yes.
And so, to me, to say that Ignatius doesn't exist, I then have to say, well, Polycarp maybe doesn't exist or is making him up. Lucian of Samosata, who has no skin in the game, might be making him up. And Irenaeus, a generation on, has been passed on nothing but deception and lies, which is then carried on by Origen, so on and so forth. So I just want to really just emphasize that I understand why some people get quite angry at the church or about Christianity, and then they naturally led down a path of making everyone a myth. But also, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You can hate the church and be angry at early Christianity or whatever it might be, but don't just then say, well, forget it. None of it's right.
Well, and just kind of to build on that, I mean, Jack, you're spot on, and I think you said it very well. So this is a problem. Who's going to continue to make these forgeries on a fake person that everybody keeps buying? Because as the time goes on, these forgeries grow in size and number. And now they're embellished to the point where you have this figure talking with John the Apostle, which most people don't deny. Perhaps a John who was with Jesus, maybe, or somebody who was called one of the 12 by that name, or Mary, the Blessed Mother. I mean, like, when you start getting into this discussion, the church is not going to continue to circulate more and more forgeries in the name of a person who was never believed to be true. The forgeries existing and the recensions were existing and even expanding almost paints a better picture for us that people really did believe somebody like this existed, and that somebody like this did die. And even if they embellished it, even if they painted it up, even if they put more lipstick on it, I mean, at the end of the day, they believed that there was this figure and they were trying to impersonate him because he was an important figure to the church. So even the expansion of the documents with his name on it would not be done if he was a myth. They're going to continue to build on it because he was an important figure. And by putting an important figure on the document gives it some sort of weight to continue to teach and build on these stories in his life. So I echo it, what Jack said as well. In addition to all that, I think that the expansion of his texts and his fame speak more to the reality of the person, even when people are trying to plagiarize and to fake and give us a document with his name on it.
I'm gonna play this clip because this is the one Jack was talking about. Yes, it's from my channel. I took this. I made this YouTube short based on a longer video I did with Robin. So here it is.
And I'm not a mythicist is because I think it's way too much effort to have to dispel. Paul tells us, he talks to James, he talks to Peter, that these were Christ followers in his lifetime. It's too much work for me, and he doesn't get along with them either. It's too much work for me to imagine like those two made up Jesus, and now Paul's making up, knowing the guys who knew it, and that it's all just like a fake thing. I don't think human beings work that way sociologically very often. So he has to claim I'm talking to the risen Christ because his so-called competitors, not competitors like super apostles, but other people who are claiming authority with the early church, actually knew the guy. And so he's able to claim like, well, I talked to him more recently than you did. And so it's really important to him to have that Christ figure, that risen Jesus, those divination experiences as a source of authority.
I want to just talk to that for a moment. I actually debated a mythicist on your channel. I debated Richard Carrier. And one of the things that I find so exceptionally hilarious about this whole skeptic journey is that when I pushed him on the Pauline epistles, and I push any mythicist, I mean, this could be for any mythicist that you want to talk about, except maybe Nina, because Nina now doesn't necessarily accept historical Paul. You then say, well, why do you accept so much what Paul says? Like, why is it you rely on Paul's epistles as if they're genuine? I mean, how do you know they're genuine? I mean, what about Marcion's Paul? Why is that not genuine? Or how do you know that the 7 letters or the 3 letters, or which letter collection of Paul are you talking about? The 10, the 13, the 14? The skepticism only goes so far on this question for my mind and my money, and I find that just quite problematic. That if you're going to rely so heavily on Paul, at least know what you mean by Paul, the nuances surrounding Pauline scholarship, and the idea that there might even not be a Pauline corpus. Well, sorry, there is a Pauline corpus, but it might not be the letter collection that you're referring to. Now, I know Stephen might find that a bit far for his palate for this particular discussion, and I'm at risk of excommunicating myself from the church. But you get the point. It's like, if we're going to go down the skeptic route and we're going to be skeptical, then you've at least got to push as far as to say, how do I know what Paul is saying is true? And how do I know what letter collection of Paul or recension of Paul I should be dealing with? because I think that's a very important question, and I have a lot of respect for Robin Faith Walsh. Like I say, as with no skin in the game, she has made I think a pretty good observation, despite the fact that many people are claiming it's flawed.
So where do you want to pick up next to continue? I guess my next question would be, Jack, could you expand more on Stephen's idea that the free letter collection could be part of a summary? And so maybe the author's not really trying to remove all the stuff as it would seem. Like, what do you think about that?
And if I can, Jack, so you can respond better. If he's writing biography, if that's his point, is to focus on to teach in a catechesis way a hero of their faith. He's writing about the man, not about all the extra, because the church already accepts the resurrection. They already accept the bishopric. They already accept the threefold ministry. They already accept the Eucharist. They already accept the sacrament of marriage, where the bishop has to approve marriages. Like there's no need for him to hash out things that the church has already affirmed, but to make it about the man. And do you not see, kind of in question with Jacob, do you not see that tendency happening quite a bit in a lot of places there that's more than convenient? I guess kind of to add on that. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to add that.
Did you find Alan's article? Oh no, I didn't send you it. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, so this was also another version of an argument made by Alan Brent, although he presents it slightly differently to you.
He does.
His version I think is slightly more unrealistic.
You did send it to me, by the way.
Did I? Okay. Yeah, so Alan's version of this is that there are several amanuenses copying the words of Ignatius with different emphases. Okay, fine. That seems unlikely. So, but in the same way, Stephen, I think yours is not as unlikely as Alan's. My response is that I can totally see where you're coming from, but the problem is that these texts do tend to, and we shouldn't assume, but they do tend to grow rather than shrink. And it's usually the case that when they grow, the growth, like is with the long recension, due to the addition of more complex modern theologies that are trying to be incorporated. And that is the tendency that we see from the short to the middle. But even if we put all of that aside, I still find it really tough to imagine that the stylistic elements can be overlooked. I think that ultimately, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. Even above the theology or the attestations, it's the stylistic elements that I find really difficult to get over, because the removal of a pathetic little word like huper, I mean, how has that happened? I mean, and if we had one example of this, I might be able to understand it, but it just happens so consistently that these tiny words are gone that the redactor must have either been purposely trying to get rid of them because he hates certain verbal tics or certain verbal constructions, or that he was just really, really lucky. And I don't think even with our modern ideas of redaction, we could make that claim. I think even with AI, or maybe with AI, actually, I take it back. With AI, we could do it. Before the world of AI, let us say, even with Control H, find and replace, even then, I think it's quite a difficult task to do that.
Yeah, I don't think that would have happened out of convenience there. I think what the part that keeps me from being where Jack is that there is a translational different element. Now, there is a middle recension Syriac, but it's much, much later. If we had a Greek short recension that aligned with the Syriac short recension, I would probably be on Jack's side. Some of the difficulty, and Jack knows this as well as anybody, there are problems in the comparative analysis from language to language, especially if the Latin is preserving original readings against the Greek that it may have been written in. I'm not excusing the fact that there's probably some Latin preserved original readings of Ignatius that are not in the Greek recensions at all, long or short. It could be that Latin had preserved certain sections, I think, in Romans. I mean, that's another discussion for another day. I even think Lightfoot was willing to concede. Zahn was willing to concede some of those things, that the Latin tradition may have preserved, in the long recension, original formation of words. And so the hard part about all of this, and it's really the only thing that keeps middle recension people from being able to be dogmatic and Jack from being dogmatic, because there's a massive missing piece to the puzzle right in the middle of the puzzle. We've got all the edges of this puzzle put together. And we have a half picture on the right and a half picture on the left. And we're trying to guess at what the middle of that picture is that brings it all together. The short recension people are taking their perspective on the analysis, which, by the way, I haven't read anybody do a better job than Jack on the analysis yet. I haven't read anybody. Now, unfortunately, nobody else has probably had the opportunity to read Jack's work yet because it's still coming out, and I had the privilege of reading it in advance. So I think that when it is released, it's going to create a better forced argument over here on the short recension that's going to not allow the, as he calls it, cherry picking that Lightfoot did on certain word choices on the other side of the argument from the middle recension. And that I concede. And I also concede, and Jack knows I concede on this, I'm willing to let go of a lot of readings in the middle recension because they're problematic. So if we were to look at it this way, the problem is we're missing a big piece of the puzzle. And the big piece of the puzzle is we only have one manuscript of the short recension, or manuscript collection of the short recension in Syriac. If we had one in Greek, it would make this language comparison more accurate and a lot better for data points. And we don't know the Syriac scribe, monk, or whoever did it. We don't know his tendency of translation formation from Greek to Syriac, because there are in places some difficult things to transition over from language. Some are not. And Jack probably has more examples of where it is difficult to move from Greek to Syriac. But this scribe, his tendency seems to not be on the minuscule, but the major things that are going on. Here's Ignatius. Here's the story. Here's the point of his life. And it's almost like he's creating almost a biography of the man more than a working theology or an idea of him. And this seems to be a Syriac tradition. In fact, we have very little Syriac tradition. We have no evidence they even knew of writings that were circulating in the West and the East pretty well. For example, the Shepherd of Hermas, to our knowledge, there's no Syriac father, there's no Syriac manuscript that preserves the Shepherd of Hermas. None. We don't have any evidence that it even existed in the Syriac at any point. They didn't seem to have as much to work with as the Greek and the Latin world. And so that could have created major problem there. What we do even see in their limitation, Tatian didn't even give them a four gospel corpus. He gave them a harmonized of the four gospel corpus. It wasn't until after Tatian, the Syriac, they're one of the last groups of people to get the four gospel corpus. One of the last groups in the church. They probably had it, but they didn't have a copy of it. And even Tatian didn't help them with that. He just gave a harmonization summary. So what if the Syriac scribe at this time, which isn't too far removed from Tatian and all the four corpus, what if he was doing what the Syriac tradition has done? And that is summaries, not entire narratives or entire works, but preserving the bulk of it rather than the majority. I'm not saying I'm right, by the way. I'm just posing these ideas that need to be talked about, because I didn't see Lightfoot talk about this as much. Brent did give a similar argument to it. And I think you emailed that to me about 3 weeks before I released the paper. And so he kind of gave me, and I didn't care for his I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying I didn't make me feel good about it enough to say, I agree with him 100% here. I felt like he said enough to make me think on a different level about it, which is where I came with my summary. And I love Brent, by the way. I think he's phenomenal.
Yeah, good friend. Just to say, did you say that there are 3 manuscripts of the short recension?
Right. All of which are in Syriac, and they're probably around that same time, same scribe, or at least in the same school of scribes.
Yeah, we have 2 manuscripts of the 3 letters, and then 1 manuscript just of Polycarp. But yeah, you're right. I mean, they were all found in the same library, the Convent of Mary. Oh, I can't remember the name now. In the Nitrian Desert. What was the name of that monastery? Whatever it was. Yeah, and they date between sort of the 7th, 8th, perhaps even the 6th century. So yeah, they are definitely a family.
If there was a Greek short recension that was not in the 15th century, it would make this harder for middle recension arguments, because it would fill in that puzzle piece that's missing in the middle. And I think it would add even further weight to Jack's argument, where we would have to start almost from square one again. The fact that it only survives, and if I said one manuscript, Jack, I misspoke. One corpus of Syriac manuscripts that are probably from the same scribe or the school of scribes in that same monastery. If that's the case, then obviously we know that their purpose and reasoning would all be the same, unified. But what I'm speaking of is if we had even a Latin or particularly a Greek short recension. I would take a Latin short recension at this point if it helped make the argument even better. I think that there's only one independent text creates more problems for the comparative work, especially if the Latin is preserving original readings in places, because now that's really difficult going from Syriac to Latin as opposed to just Greek to Syriac. If that makes sense.
Yeah, the only addition makes that is it's quite clear that the Syriac text that we have does come from a Greek translation.
Clearly.
So yeah, I mean, I agree if we found it. And I don't think it's unlikely that we find it, because of the position I hold that it's earlier and it does come from Greek. I think that it exists. I feel a little bit like James Ussher and all of those early fellows who, when they only had the Latin long recension, that they thought, gosh, wouldn't it be great if we found a Greek? And then they find a Greek, and then they say, wouldn't it be better if we found a middle Greek? And then they found another Greek, and so on and so forth. You know, I wonder whether we get there. And like I say, it's also the case that this all applies particularly for Polycarp and Ephesians, but with Romans we have to take another journey and another detour into Arabic to understand quite what's happened to Romans. But it's going to be on the channel hopefully in the coming weeks, where we do a further deep dive into Polycarp. So we did Polycarp into Ephesians and Romans. So hopefully then we'll be able to display to you all of the little niggles and nuances that come along with Ignatius' letter to the Romans.
By the way, a little fun fact that Wright points out in the catalog manuscripts that are, I believe it's in the British Museum now, if I'm not mistaken. It was found in the monastery, but I think the British Museum actually has the collection of these Syriac short recension manuscripts. The scribe, that Syriac scribe, adds 2 letters on love and charity by John the monk. And so, and he attributes a lot of that to Ignatius as well. So that is something I kind of footnoted that in my paper. I didn't want to deviate too much because it was already getting hefty. And hopefully, and maybe Jacob, I don't know if you have the link to the paper that could maybe people could read to kind of see what I'm saying. I keep referring to it, and maybe they can click on it and see for themselves. It would be interesting, the motive of the scribe too. What is he trying to do, especially when you have additional 2 letters on the subject of love, which possibly could be homilies. But there's also attributing them to St. Ignatius. So what kind of view of Ignatius and correspondence did they have in that monastery? There's so much we don't know about these monks or these scholars and scribes that are in this Syriac monastery, what their intended purpose was. Were they actually trying to do just create like a little mini manual that consisted of some sort of catechism of the saints? And particularly, what was the overarching theme about them? I think I would love, Jack, for more to come out from that Syriac tradition, maybe of a pattern. And this is one of the things I wanted to start the discussion on when I wrote, is he patterning himself after the Diatessaron? Is he doing something like Tatian would do? Why is it that we see the Syriac church is almost the last one to receive multiple things here? Why is it that they are the last one to get kind of a full, complete corpus of Gospels? Why is it that this is the church that summarizes a lot and shortens a lot of things in other places to create the greater purpose and the greater theme rather than all the extra to make that theme. Just like give it a golden thread and put the end of it. Here's the main message of it all. Here's the summary of it all kind of thing. Is that a pattern? I'm not saying it is. My point in putting it in the paper was to create the conversation of let's think why the Syriac tradition may have done this, and is it consistent with other writings in their tradition?
So I'm going to take the super chat question. Michael E., thank you for your super chat. Given the prevalence of pseudepigraphy in early Christianity, how should modern Christians approach and understand any letters, whether those attributed to Ignatius or Paul?
Well, Stephen and I might have different perspectives on this. I'm going to make, as I always do, an enemy of everybody in the chat, whether they be Christian or not. Ultimately, to my mind, the church has decided what the canon is. And it doesn't matter, therefore, forgive me when I say it doesn't matter, I don't mean that as an absolute, but it doesn't matter as much who wrote them. Once the church has decided that they're canon, that's it. They're canon as far as the church is concerned. When it comes to Ignatius, I think that, again, we have to look for the evidence. What do we think we can attribute to him? And I will never be able to say for certain that the letter that you read on that page was penned by the hand or dictated by the mouth of Ignatius. I can only make the best guess that I can based on the evidence I have. And I think that one of the things that I find very difficult about this question is that the bar seems to be set a lot higher for early Christian texts than it does for some other ancient texts, partly due to a bias against Christianity. So when I find that, even the most secular, non-Christian, no skin in the game scholars tend to agree with me about Ignatius wrote something, Paul wrote something, then I'm at least willing to say in part, yeah, okay, this seems likely. So as a Christian, the most important thing I think is that the canon is the canon. That's the reception of, that's what's been received by the church. In terms of its authorship, of course it matters and we should discuss it, but it's not the absolute be all and end all that authorship will dictate whether or not the church recognize something to be true. Eusebius of Caesarea, for example, doesn't think that Revelation was written by John. It doesn't seem to bother him. The letters to the Hebrews, authorship a bit complex. Nobody's particularly fussed by that either. So for me, as a Christian, I read them because the church says they're canon. For Ignatius, I'm just doing my best to try and understand if we can trace something of the historicity of his story and also the letters that are extant. But Stephen will disagree with me there, I'm sure.
Not 100%, but I do think that when you're looking at the criteria that I went back to, Augustine of Hippo's criteria of finding original authorship to a document is contemporary support. You're looking at corroborated evidence over time, and you're looking for an unbroken chain of custody of information. You're looking for consistency. The church has done this in depth. It has done this over the many, many years. This has been debated. It's been argued. Things were accepted. I mean, this is by the time we get to Eusebius, that's why we have categories. You have books that were received and canonized. You have books that were not canonized, but they weren't heretical. They were still necessary. The church was using them. They were seen as helpful. They were wisdom. They were history. Some were seen as just straight heretical. So there is a methodology at looking at every text. And look, I mean, and it might mean you change your view about how you look at that text. I wouldn't touch the book of 2 Peter for years. I mean, like I was struggling when I was doing canonicity and my PhD work. And there's so many ways that we can look at the canonized book of 2 Peter without making it so simplistic. Like there are complicated methods and by which that writing could have happened that still were connected to the Apostle Peter in some form. It may not be the traditional easy breezy, here's your way it happened story, but it has a history. It has a story behind it. It has a usage. It has a function. I even demonstrate that it was circulating somewhere around Rome pretty early on. So, I mean, there are ways to look at things without being so simplistic and ignorant about it, but also looking at these through the eyes of historical transmission, looking at these through the eyes of things that have happened and given to us. You know, Christians have this really ridiculous view that God just gave us a Bible and it was on cloud 9 and it floated down and landed in our laps, and that's that, and we've got it. You know, some go so far as to say it came in King James English. I mean, like, this is the nonsense that I fight with the Christian crowd with on one hand. On the other hand, there's such a high skepticism that, like, we have nothing. I mean, like, we can't trace anything anymore. Even if we have 15 things being attested to, you can't trust any of them. They're just all borrowing from each other. This guy is just borrowing from him, who borrowed from him, who borrowed from him, who borrowed from him. Nobody has an original thought. Nobody has an original opinion. And we're so skeptical that we're back in the dark ages again. And I just don't feel like that's healthy either. I think that we can bring intellectual, critical thinking to the table that debunks hyper-skepticism and ridiculous simplicity in Christianity and come up with academic answers. And they may look different from Jack to Stephen to Jacob to whoever else. We can put it all on the table and say, these are the best arguments for the presentation we have. We don't have to be this and we don't have to be this, but we can be intellectually honest at the same time. And I just think that if we take the criteria that have been put in front of us historically, we're going to land somewhere that's going to be fair and balanced to a lot of different positions, because some things are just, you can't be dogmatic on. As far as the church goes, the church has canonized these texts of the New Testament. Ignatius is not. I do think it's interesting. We haven't brought this up yet. Pope Leo the 14th, our new pope, and Jack texted me immediately when he gave his first homily, and he referenced Ignatius's writings to the Romans twice in his homily. The very opening section about presiding in love and charity. And he saw that as his role as the new Bishop of Rome. And then he also quoted later on a discussion about the martyrdom and his journey there, being put in chains. And so it's like, all right, well, the new Pope believes Ignatius was A, a real man, and B, he wrote a letter to the Romans, and C, he's a product of the purpose of that letter as the new Bishop of Rome. So cool shout out to the new Pope. Pope Leo the 14th quoted Ignatius in his first homily. Of all the church fathers he could have quoted, he quoted Ignatius of Antioch to Rome, which is fascinating.
Grazy174, thank you for your super chat. Do each of you thank Smyrnians free to touch me and see I am not a bodiless demon is a paraphrase of Luke 24:49 or a separate non-canonical appearance?
It could be a hybrid here, and particularly what we know of it in First Principles, it's attributed by Origen to it's called the teaching of Peter. I talk about this in my article. Now, at the same time, Jerome quotes the section and attributes it potentially to Ignatius, but he also has this idea that perhaps, I think it's in Illustrious Men 16, if I'm remembering properly, that it's possibly connected to a tradition in the Gospel of the Nazarenes. Sometimes it's referred to as the Gospel of the Hebrews. And so there's a lot of debate about, is this original to Ignatius? Is this original? So did Ignatius originate this? Did Ignatius give a summary of Luke, which is in the question? Did Ignatius borrow this from a document, the Doctrine of Peter? Did the Doctrine of Peter get it from Ignatius? Did it come from the Gospel of the Nazarenes or the Gospel of the Hebrews? So we kind of see this phrase show up not in a singular location. And I actually spend a little bit of time talking about it in my article as well. Jack and Jack, I don't know where you believe. I think you land with it being particularly from the Doctrina of Petri, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I thought you did. But it's interesting that, Jerome attributes it to Ignatius, but doesn't limit it to Ignatius. He actually makes the argument that it could have came from the Gospel of the Hebrews, which would be interesting in itself. This is some sort of preserved statement orally that was both in the West and in North Africa. That would be kind of interesting. And then obviously Antioch. So that'd be interesting to see who said it first. Where did it come from? Or were they all building some sort of summary off of Luke?
My supervisor, if I might recommend a book, wrote, and are you ready for me to butcher some German? He wrote an article called "Ich bin kein Corpulus Gichtwesen," something like that. I am not an incorporeal being, in his book that he wrote with his Dr. Vater Reinhard Hübner called Der Paradox einer. And he talks about this passage at length. And he also talks about, in particular, the relation of Smyrnaeans and the Middle Recension knowing Noetus of Smyrna. He thinks the Middle Recension is highly influenced by Noetus and is a rebuttal against it. My thought process towards this passage, particularly in relation to Luke, is going to be quite controversial, I suppose, compared to Stephen, in that I think that Luke's gospel doesn't come into its final form until the 2nd century, and therefore the Middle Recension takes this on as part of that new sort of authoritative text. So its origins may be early in terms of, touch me and see that I'm not a bodiless demon. That could be a 1st century saying of Jesus, but the textual transmission of it is not till much later. I don't want to continue a row I've been having in the comments, but I mean, I don't think that the Gospels in their final form are 1st century texts. I think they're 2nd century, and so Luke is the most problematic of those. And I think that it's funny that then one of the most problematic letters of Ignatius also comes into contact with the most problematic gospel of the 4 that we have.
I'm telling the new Pope on Jack, and I hope he gets excommunicated.
That's not unlikely. You should.
It's a good question, though. Good observation on that, because that is a controversial section in there.
Yeah, and just to repeat the book, Der Paradox einer, ich bin kein Corpulus Gichtwesen. Again, if you speak German better than I do, I had to run it through DeepL when I read it, so maybe I'm a bit of a mess.
So now I'd like to shift real quick to focus a little bit more on the martyrdom story of Ignatius. I know some try to say that, we need to be skeptical about the Ignatian martyrdom. The evidence isn't good that he was martyred. I think some of them out there say that. What are y'all's thoughts on this?
Jack kind of alluded to this earlier as it related to, we have too much here, contemporary like Polycarp in chapter 9 and in chapter 13, and there's some controversy even about that. But we have a companion who's referencing it. We have John Malalas, we have Origen, we have Irenaeus, and we have Eusebius, not borrowing from each other. Maybe Eusebius is getting some of his information from Origen because they share the same library by the end of the day. But that's not the case with Irenaeus. That's not the case particularly with John Malalas. And so I struggle to see how it's possible to make this up. Now, again, there's different views about when and how and the possibility of this, because there's even later dates. I mean, Hübner and Jolly, for example, I mean, they have this thing way late. I mean, the post mid-2nd century kind of idea. Some have posed it in the Hadrian timeline, which I wrote a whole section on both these on Hübner and Jolly's timeline, and particularly those that hold to a Hadrian timeline. But from Trajan's standpoint, as I have no reason to doubt the corroborated statements that we have to place it in the timeline of Trajan. The timing is right. The killings are right. The prisoners being transported is right. The repairing of the roads is right. So we have cause to accept his martyrdom and the destination. Now, I know that Jack and I differ on where that destination started, but we have reason to believe a cause and effect and even the process for something like this to have happened. I know that there's a lot of writings today and there's different books and articles that are being put out and circulated. There's a lot of fighting about, were Christians even persecuted at all? Were these embellishments? Were these made up martyrdom stories to give heroism in the church? Things like that. I mean, it's come up a lot in the last really 2 years, I would say, is kind of growing traction. But we have too much here. Maybe the stories are not as embellished as like the martyrdom of Ignatius tells it, or the martyrdom of Polycarp tells of his. you know, in the martyrdom story of Polycarp, it is very interesting as to what happens when he's dying, what happens to people that are around the dead body, etc. Okay, maybe that stuff is embellished, but it's embellishing a true story. It may have just been a quick execution or a very long, torturous execution, and there's not a lot of pretty story to tell around it, but to celebrate his martyrdom, it's painted up in some of these martyrdom stories. It doesn't mean the story isn't true. The embellishment of it might not be true, but the person actually dying may be true in itself. Jack touched on this a little bit more. I'll let him expound on it more than he did earlier if he wants to on this.
Yeah, I mean, we differ slightly. I mean, I think that that Ignatius is probably arrested somewhere already in the West and then brought to Rome, and that itinerary makes more sense not only from an historical perspective of what we know about the transportation of criminals, but also one of the things that the Middle Recension I think is so sort of confused about is that these 10 leopards, as he calls them, these soldiers that are carrying him from Antioch to Rome, who are so brutal and nasty, also let him receive several parties of visitors from fellow Christians so that he can write more letters to continue to continue to encourage people in the faith. That to me just seems almost preposterous. Whereas on the flip side, you know, if he was arrested somewhere in the West and just then taken quickly to the West, further slightly west, for one of these games or martyrdom sessions, whatever they were, then that just seems far more practical and easier to believe. I'd also say that another reason why I think he was probably killed is because Polycarp asks, well, maybe he asks, Polycarp says, we know what happened to Ignatius in chapter 9 of his letter to the Philippians. He says, well, you know, Ignatius, along with his two friends, have gone to their death. And then later on in chapter 13, if you believe it's genuine, which I don't, but maybe we could argue for a second it is, he then says, what happened to them? You know, how were they killed? So he seems to just have this knowledge that they were killed, but not how that happened, even if you accept all of Polycarp. But irrespective of that, they know that he was killed. Irenaeus, again, also seems to know of Ignatius' death. And I think that those are better examples. I mean, Stephen has a couple of times mentioned John Molasses, and that's not wrong necessarily, but obviously he's dealing quite a lot later than Polycarp and Irenaeus.
Sure.
Irenaeus and Polycarp are within one generation. So we've got people who we know that Ignatius would have had some correspondence with, and that person then asks, what happened to this guy? So if we're going to say that Ignatius didn't have a martyrdom, let's just take that for a moment, then we also have to say that Polycarp was misled about Ignatius' fate and that he was confused. Or we say that Polycarp was making it up and he writes a letter to the Philippians asking for the information of the whereabouts of a man who didn't exist or wasn't going to be killed. Or we have to say that Polycarp's letter was made up, in which case Irenaeus might have something more to say about that. Or that the person of Polycarp generally was made up, and then that's another problem, and again, in relation to Justin Martyr and Irenaeus. So you see that this starts to snowball pretty quickly if we begin to take out some of the earlier dominoes. So yeah, I think that Ignatius is killed. I don't think it's a big fanfare. I think he just gets taken from the West, slightly further west, and bites the dust over there. Big sad.
Do you think, Jack, that I know you don't put as much weight on Malalas as perhaps I do, and I know he's later, but he's in his chronicle. He's not really, his whole work isn't about Ignatius. He's just kind of going through different things. But I would say that his testimony, and this is just something that I've come convinced of, and Jonathan Lucadou is probably influential on me on this. By the way, anybody should read what he has to say about Ignatius at any time. If you can find any of his writings, some of them are not accessible without payment, but some of them you can find on Ignatius. Wonderful Ignatian scholar. Wonderful. I think Malalas gets underrated here. And I think that Malalas is just as valuable as Eusebius on this. And that's because Malalas gives us major events that surround it that Eusebius doesn't. For example, the earthquake. He talks about the Antiochian earthquake, which is December of 115 or January of 115. There's a lot of argument about when it happened around that time, and it could be either. So he's saying that Trajan was in Antioch during that time period of the Great Earthquake. So he gives us kind of a timeline of when things started falling apart for Ignatius. He gives us a motive. Why would Trajan have gone after somebody like Ignatius? Well, what's the point? If he was in the city of Antioch at the same time that Ignatius was a bishop of Antioch, and there's pagan festivities, there's celebration, he doesn't honor Trajan, he doesn't give him due homage, and he doesn't honor his gods publicly and defiantly, well, that's just enough to piss somebody off to take him back to have him killed, especially a prized defier. So Malalas kind of gives us more, not just timeline, but intent. And some people think that Ignatius died around 107. I have friends that are completely confident in that date. I've leaned more to it being closer to 115 to 117, more to the 117 line, 116, 117. I think Malalas actually gives us better reasoning and motive for it. So I think Lucadou does well to put more emphasis on the Malalas testimony that a lot of people don't give much to or underwhelmingly use it. So I'm not sure. I don't think we've ever had that conversation, Jack, like how much weight you put on Malalas.
Again, yeah, not as much as you. I think that's for several reasons. I mean, I think partly because he seems to add some legendary embellishments, let's say, to Ignatius. I think that his commentary on Ignatius already shows that he's been fooled by some, with, for example, by calling him Theophorus, which I don't think is what Ignatius really calls himself. I think that he mentions, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, he also mentions like an amphitheater or somewhere where, a big place where Ignatius was killed. And I'm also doubtful about Ignatius being martyred in the Colosseum, for example, although Malalas doesn't say that specifically. If he was going to say that, I'd be very skeptical. I just struggle with a later commentator. I'm in the same way. Again, I even struggle with Eusebius. I just think that he writes so much further away from the event, and he clearly has some problematic features in what he says that whenever he says anything, I always have it with a slight air of caution.
But he must be independent, right? Because he's not depending on Eusebius or Origen for his information. He has an independent testimony. Even if you think it's embellished, it should be taken into consideration, right? I know he's 6th century, but he has an independent testimony about him that's different from Eusebius or lacks in Eusebius's testimony, and vice versa. So he must have some sort of independent testimony that's not just copying and pasting. Like Jerome does a lot of that to Eusebius on this. Like he's definitely depending on Eusebius a lot when it comes to the subjects, but Malalas is not.
Yeah, I mean, in part, I hear that, but then we also get Socrates of Constantinople, who says that Ignatius had this great vision in heaven and that he created singing in church. That's an independent witness. No one ever said that before. I'm not discounting it at all, but just as from a historian's perspective, I'm trying to get as close to the event as possible. Just because I know what the comments are going to respond to this, right? I know what the commentators are going to respond to this. Oh, it's so far away. It's like, yeah, but I mean, sometimes Suetonius and Tacitus are pretty close to the events and get stuff completely cockamamie. So I'm not discrediting that you can have a later guy telling the truth. It's just, I just prefer to place more of a weight towards Polycarp and also the letters themselves.
Well, and naturally we all start there. And that's why I said we always start with companions and then we look for attestation, corroboration. To me, regardless of Eusebius or Malalas, Trajan's reign makes sense, whether it's in that 107 to 117. I see no reason to doubt it.
I would only doubt it in the sense I want it to be earlier. I think it's like 109 or 108. That's only my doubt, and I say that because I just don't think the short recension has any knowledge of like these later issues, right? That's the other thing I find absolutely brilliant about the short recension, is that he just doesn't tend to embroil himself in these later arguments. And that's again why I think his theology is narrow and shallow, is because the sheer amount of heresies, or the inverted commas heresies, that have become prevalent, particularly as with the rise of Marcion and Valentinus and Basilides or whatever else. These are the guys that the middle recension tends to acknowledge, particularly Noetus, as Marcus has pointed out. Whereas short recension, he's not bothered by any of this, which makes me think, gosh, he must be early, because he can't be bothered to engage with all this, lunacy.
JM, thank you for your super chat and a thumbs up. Jesus Tales, thank you for your super chat. Apologies for my unfamiliarity, but is Cephas a later addition to the Galatians text? If so, why?
No, I mean, we have no reason to think so. Cephas is just the Aramaic name for Petros. I mean, Petros is Peter, a rock. I mean, Cephas is the name, same name. We don't have any textual variation in the manuscripts that would... The only time that would make sense is if somebody has Petros and the other section has Cephas. One has the Greek and one has the Aramaic. But it's pretty consistent in the manuscript tradition we have of Paul for Galatians that has Cephas there. I do think that there's a unique technique that Paul does. If you ever go through the Pauline epistles, he uses Peter or Simon Peter's Greek name when talking about him isolated. Him as a person isolated. But anytime he's mentioned with a group of people or the other apostles, Paul's technique is to call him by his Aramaic name, Cephas. We find that in his testimony of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. We find it in Galatians. Anytime he refers to Peter, he's talking about him with a group of disciples or a group or the church as a whole. He calls him by his Aramaic name. I made this argument when I debated Dr. Carrier. But then when he's just isolated by himself, he goes straight to his Greek name, Petros, which is interesting. Either way, they both mean rock. Either way, it's the name given to him in Matthew 16. So I don't think that there's any later additions to Galatians, because the manuscript tradition on Galatians is actually pretty solid. There's not a lot of variants in the Galatian manuscript tradition that we have. Very few that are significant.
Here comes the loony. So I largely agree with that. I would just point out maybe that in the Apostolos, which is Marcion's version of this text, and I'm just double checking here that I have the latest edition, but assuming that I do, Cephas is only used once in Marcion's Paul in 1 Corinthians 3:22, and then not anywhere else, which is interesting. I do wonder whether Marcus might have gone back and changed that. Like I said, I'm just checking. No, it's still present as far as I can see. So, yeah, interesting there, the way that Marcion's Paul in the Apostolos uses Cephas versus Petros. I think that we actually spoken about that on our channel. So maybe go and check it.
So I think to wrap this up, I want to ask this question. First I'll ask you, Stephen. Stephen, could you expand more on, and you touched on this earlier, but can you expand more on what would persuade you of Jack's position?
Sure. Yeah, I think Jack's position is a good brain exercise for everybody in the middle recension not to be so solid and confident in the exact text that we have in the middle recension. It needs a lot of work. It also causes us to think deeply about the scribe behind the Syriac transmissions that we have of the short recension. It also causes us to look at how the patristics were using and which letters and why it's conveniently similar. Now, I would argue the Smyrnans is being used earlier as well, and we have an early copy of the Smyrnans. But it would take even a Latin. I'd take Latin at this point. Particularly, I'd prefer that we have a Greek short recension manuscript appear that is consistent with what we see in the scribe and the Syriac manuscript. And I'm not talking about some 15th century. I'm talking something compatible with the time or even earlier or slightly later that would reflect that this was because again, if Ignatius's letters were distributed, even just to Polycarp and Smyrna, to the Romans and to Ephesus, this should have been a consistent transmission that is found evidentially laid out in these other places. What we do have in these other places, including Syria and the Syriac, are middle recension forms. It could be argued that a lot of times they're quoting sections that are not really disputed between the middle and short recension. So we don't know what they're quoting because they're in both. So it's hard to say. There's arguments about one single word. Lightfoot makes one single word on a preposition, I believe, that would reflect closer to the middle recension than the short in quotes of Irenaeus. But we don't, again, it leaves so many open doors to debate. But I would adopt more of Jack's reading if we saw a wider distribution of the short recension in the manuscript forms of the text themselves. And I would take Latin at this point to cause me to turn more to his position. Greek would really radically change my position if that happens. And again, I'm not sitting here like, this is it. Like, it's done. No more debate. We're right. Everybody on the other side is wrong. That's not my view. My view is the evidence points to this at this point. I can easily be persuaded with the evidence. And it would take something like that for me to start going, all right, Jack might be right here. But I'm intrigued in the meantime. And I think that I handle it a lot more cautiously than I used to before meeting Jack and reading his work. I'm a lot more careful in how I use Ignatius, especially an apologetic standpoint. I'm a lot more careful in how I say things and which ones I quote when I need to use them. So.
Yeah, and
Jack,
sorry, I was going to answer the same question.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I was going to have the same kind of question for you anyway. Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, it'd be again a case of a critical edition, and the reason why is because I'm sometimes boxed into this place where I just think the short recension is that's it, and that's the oldest Ignatius, and that's not my position. My position is that the short recension presents probably the largest earliest reading of the text that is existent in a manuscript today, but it's by no means the oldest the oldest text just in and of itself. So I think the long recension sometimes presents the oldest reading. The middle recension sometimes does. The short recension might do sometimes. So for me, the first step is a critical edition. When we've got all the manuscripts, then we can start. It sounds so stupid to say. Until we've actually got the text, what are we supposed to say about them, right? We haven't even looked at some of these manuscripts yet, and they could have something completely wild. I think that we're fairly locked in terms of the long recension and the longer recension, but particularly with the 2 extra recensions of Romans, these are almost entirely new fields of play. And once we have then that critical edition, I would not be surprised to say something along the lines of every recension's got its issues. Every recension probably needs to be considered every word. Every recension in every word needs to be considered, and at each time, the long, the middle, or the short could present the oldest reading. And the only thing that could get me to a point where I would say, yes, the middle recension of 7 letters as is true would either be a full manuscript of it that's early, because at the moment we don't really have a manuscript of the 7 letters in the middle recension, or a quite clear attestation. Let's say by some great miracle, we found I don't know the works of, I don't know why he would quote from him necessarily, but the books of Apelles, the heretical student of Marcion, and for some reason he decides to go on a rampage against Ignatius and quotes at length from the letters to the Magnesians. Well, that's pretty good. Or even, and maybe this would convince me as well, if we came to a very concrete conclusion that the 13th chapter of Polycarp to the Philippians was genuine, that might play a part in my conversion, as it were, as well. But more likely, it would have to be the critical edition, because, as I said, the amount of recensions, letter collections, I don't think there'll be one silver bullet that does this for anybody. I think it's going to be a really painful, lengthy, drawn-out process.
And I'd like to remind everybody real quick before we close that the link or the tags to Facts and the Patristica YouTube channels are in the description below. And also the link to the Apostolos or Marcion's Paul's reconstruction on Zenodo is in the description below, and also the link to Stephen Boyce's article on the quest for Ignatius of Antioch is also in the description in the description below.
Gosh, you'll be reading for the next 3 weeks with all that material.
And with that being said, Jack and Stephen, thank you both very much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.